bone broth as a remedy or as an essential component of a meal is as old as people have been cooking. As long as there has been a hierarchy or a class system around food and who's preparing it, bone broth was more than just a delicious soup. It was really food thrift at its best, and that's what makes it a traditional food, is that it was a peasant tradition around food and making food go a little farther. Where the muscle meats were prized for their flavor and texture, the bones were otherwise thrown to the dogs, but that's where the real nutrient density came in the animal, was in the bones and the organ meats. And so this was a way for a family to be really conservative with their decisions around food, and you can make batches and batches around a bone that will still have more. It takes a long time to draw all of that mineral density and gelatin out of a bone. So a lot of traditional cultures would use it as an aperitif because it stimulates digestion, it helps normalize stomach acid levels, but it also helps set the stage for digestion and absorption in the gut. So by giving the nervous system, and so much of our enteric nervous system is our gut, a little bit of a soothing introduction to a meal, we actually give ourselves an opportunity to digest and absorb our foods better, because we can't physically do that unless our parasympathetic nervous system is engaged. So we have to be relaxed in order to make the most of our food. And so having a little bit of bone broth before a meal is as old as people have been eating food, especially in times of protein scarcity. So if a family didn't have access to animal products, but they had access to bones, which are shelf stable, they're dry, they can last indefinitely, this was an opportunity for them to get through without forcing their bodies into a starvation state where it would then begin cannibalizing its own bone and muscle stores in order to make up the difference. The nutrition in a bone broth is very interesting because really at its base you can treat it as a protein and mineral supplement. But in the way that it's coming as a gelatin with all of these other minerals coming out of the bone, it comes in a form that the body doesn't have to work to digest. So what that means is that all of that energy the body would have otherwise spent digesting a protein or breaking down other aspects in a food so that it could have access to those minerals, it already has. So it can take all of that energy and put it into healing, which is an opportunity the body doesn't get very often because eating is such an important part of our lives, our energy, our everyday. So to give the body everything it needs, but also give it a break, is sort of, that's where the foundation of healing begins, and that's where all of those very nutrient-dense elements come in. But also for a lot of people that are dealing with health conditions that inhibit their ability to absorb nutrition, it's a way to make sure they are guaranteed nutrition in a very, very accessible form. Bone broth isn't available in a lot of stores. It's fallen out of fashion for a long time because people don't really think of cooking with broth or stock, or especially making bone broth, unless they're ill. Anyone in food will talk about using broths and stocks as a way of layering and building flavor. Very rarely do people talk about it outside of that. So in terms of like that ego-based food tradition I was talking about previously, you would think of broth as a foundational element in a kitchen. For the everyday chef at home, it's an unusual cooking ingredient that they would probably only seek out when they were ill, for that Jewish penicillin folk remedy idea. But again, bone broth for many years has been sort of relegated to this treatment protocol, this treatment thing. We've been sought out by people that are very ill. People don't think of it as a preventative. They don't think of it as a food supplement for optimal wellness, because the mentality around food for generations now has not been around thinking of food as something that has an effect on our health. And we haven't been in the mindset of thinking of food as something that participates as a preventative in terms of our health, that maintaining optimal wellness is something that we actively, proactively engage in, rather than something that's just something we take for granted until we are struck with disease. So having now this time where people are starting to finally recognize that there's reward to thinking ahead of illness and preventing illness, it's nice to see some of these traditional foods like bone broth coming back in, where really they're there to be supportive of optimal health, to prevent illness, to keep our bodies and our immune system strong and functioning, rather than just something we bring in to help get over the hump of an illness or to help see us through the bulk of a degenerative disease. And it's really exciting to see people thinking ahead rather than thinking so gratuitously and immediately about flavor. But that doesn't mean that eating or treating food as medicine can't be delicious. It absolutely can be delicious, and it can be part of just how we live our lives and how we treat food. But it does take a little forethought, and it does take a lot more cooking, and it does take a really important sense around sourcing and the way those animals are raised and processed and fed. So, but people are starting to finally ask those questions, which is why they're suddenly becoming relevant again.